Hello, so the next video I think we're going to look at is making a video on how to control who can log into who can access a repository, um, or rather who can submit to specific collections. So the quickest way to do this is just to give you a potted history of the groups, first of all. So you can create accounts with people. So that's they're usually called, or they're traditionally in DSpace have been called people. So we've got some accounts here and so on. And if you go to the groups, you will always get two default groups. One is anonymous, and one is administrator. You can forget this one for now. I think that's going to disappear when we get rid of the ref functionality. And you'll see that there are three administrators, both of yourselves, and then this one should never be deleted because this is our rescue one where I come in and help you, or one of my colleagues would. So that's groups. Now, but when you go into anonymous, nobody is ever listed in anonymous, and you never add anyone to it. It says the group has no members, but that's not correct. Anyone is an anonymous user. So if I was to go to this repository and I wasn't logged in, I would be an anonymous user. If I was created as an account on the system on the repository, but I'm not a member of any groups, the one group I'm automatically a member of is anonymous. So there's never anything in this because it's always assumed that anyone in the end user, so anyone visiting the repository, has nothing to do with your institution. They're downloading a paper and they're using it. That's an anonymous user. An anonymous logged in user is someone that's not a member of any groups or is just a person with any access. That person is also assumed to be part of anonymous for the purposes of a logged in session. So for groups, the next thing to sort of step on and say before coming back to groups actually is to go to authorization. So they're all under access control. You'll see your structure of your repository. Now, if you go to a collection, such as research publications, you get the default permissions for the repository. So here, for example, we're in the research publications collection, and there are three default read permissions, and they're all anonymous. And because this is the item, so to read the item, to access the item, so the item landing page, these are set to anonymous by default. And that means that anyone that comes in to the repository, whether they're logged in or not, will be able to access the item pages within this collection. So for any submitted items, they'll be able to read them. And the third one is the bitstream read. That's also set to anonymous by default. And that means that if you set this to something else, they wouldn't be able to download the file unless they're part of another group. So I think the video that I've got on here already covers this already in a generic form of DSpace. But if you're not sure on that, then just let me know, and I will sort of provide more explanation of that. So we got this collection policy. Now, there's no other policy there, and that's fine. That happens by default. Now let's go to the communities page, and if you again go to this research publications collection, let's use this as an example. Now, I'm an administrator, as you are, so you always have all the rights. Now, what you can do is if you go to edit collection and you want to stop, okay, and for the purposes of this video, let's create a dummy group. So we'll call it we'll add a new group, and we'll call it test group, and I will add @Maya this group, But you can come along as well as administrators, and you can come and do the same thing. You can add yourselves. So this is a test group. Okay, so we've got a test group, and one of the things, first thing you notice is I actually didn't add myself. I didn't save the changes, and this is something I do deliberately when showing people this, because often people forget to do this. So you just click change to say, because it says pending, and that will then change. And you see that now I'm a member of that group as one group. So we've created a test permissions group. Now we could use this to do a number of things. We can add people to it. The other thing you can do is also add groups. So you can add groups of people to permissions groups as well. So you could also add all the administrators. So although I'm already so it just shows you if you save that. So you can also add a group of people, or you can add a list of specific people to it. So that's important to do. You should never do anything like this. Some people do things like add administrator to the anonymous group. Don't ever do that, or add anonymous to the administrator group. That's would avoid doing anything like that. But this is a typical example. You'd create a permissions group, and you might add other permissions to it. Now, the reason for adding this is just for the purposes of being indicative through this demonstration. So the next thing you might do, for example, is then go to the communities page, and there's various ways you can use your permissions group that you've created. So think about the submission workflow. You can come down here, and if you go edit collection, you can say, if you go to the assign roles tab, by default, when you've created this collection, under this submitter section here, there's nothing is defined. That means by default, the permissions group for this is anonymous. So anyone that's got a login for the repository can come along and submit a paper to this collection. So what you can do is you can create a submissions group if you want to. Okay, like this, and you say which group, who would I like to add? You go and search for the groups, and you want to say only this particular group can add. Members of this group can add it. So anyone that's not in this group, they're not listed in here either as an individual or by being part of another group that's added to this group. They would not be able to submit. And then once you make that change, it says collection. There's now a system generated group step here that's called collection 1 submit, and if you click on it, it tells you who's allowed to submit to it, and you can see here we go. It's the test group, and it's the people in here. So anyone that's not part of this group cannot submit to this collection. So that's how you control who submits to a collection. So what would happen is if I wasn't in that group, if I go along to submissions, and then I go here and I select new submissions, if I don't have permission to then submit to that collection, it won't appear in the list here. So they wouldn't have the option of submitting to that collection. So I'll go back to that test collection. And let's go edit it again, because we probably don't want to have that at the moment. So let's just go back to it, edit the collection, assign roles. And if you want to remove it, you just delete it and it'll disappear. To delete it. So now it's back to being an anonymous collection. So again, if you wanted to restrict, that's how you would do it. You'd create the submitter step and you would apply a specific group to it, having created one in the groups section. The default read access is set to anonymous. So that's basically telling you what I've said in setting authorizations, that you can then restrict it. So you can restrict access to the collection to particular groups of people. So it would apply the same thing. You would click there, and you click here, and then you would select a group. And let's see, it will probably ask you again, what groups do you want to add? So you define only groups that you select would be able to read the actual access the collection, or they would have to log in to see it. There is already a video for that. Here already make the collection available only to logged in users, so that describes how to do that. There's more than one way to do it, but that's the simplest way. Now the 3 steps down here are other ways you can use permissions groups. These are 3 potential reviewer steps. So this is when you submit a paper. At the moment, because you have no steps defined here, either 1, 2, or 3, reviewer, editor, or final editor, they are your paper, when you submit it through your workflow, is automatically appearing in the repository. If you enable a workflow step, a review step, we suggest, unless you're a very big organization and you need to have multiple people approving a submission, you would simply create an editor workflow step, because it's a combination of the reviewer and the editor step. And again, you would select a reviewer group. You might even create a permissions group called down here in the group's permission, called reviewers or something like that. But traditionally, you might just add the admin user, because you're a small team and maybe only 1 or 2 people are ever reviewing the material, and you would create that. So what that's done here is when someone submits a paper, it will put the paper under submissions into a workflow. Now let's just see very quickly another repository, because it will have items in it that require a submissions workflow. So let's just quickly look at NHM. We log in here. So this is a real repository doing real things and so on at the moment. So if we go to their collection, if we go to, let's see now, the submissions page, you'll see, because I'm an admin and so on, you'll see workflow tasks. So in this scenario we've just described, when you make this editor step, configure it and add a group to this workflow step called collection 1 workflow editor, we've added the admins. What you would do, or whoever it is, when you come along to submissions, once the submission workflow is appeared, it will appear in here under workflow tasks. And what you would do is you would accept the task. It would be in the pool. You would go to the pool, you would accept the task, you take the task, and then it would appear up here in tasks you own. And then what you would do is you'd come in and you'd approve the item or reject the item, and you can also edit the metadata. The reason for suggesting only to configure the middle one is it means it's only one workflow step. So it's a combination of 3 possible steps, and the middle one is effectively a combination of all 3, and it saves you, unless you really need to pass it from person to person, reviewer to reviewer. That's how you would use the groups to configure a review workflow. So I just recap very quickly. I showed how to create permissions groups and how to add people to them, or add other groups to permissions groups. And then we configured how to control submissions. So you would define a submissions group, so only people who are members of that group could submit to this specific collection. How you can control, although it's covered on a separate email, how to make a collection available only to logged in users. And then I've just briefly talked through the possible reviewer step with a suggested approach if you do need a review workflow step for a post-submission approval, that you start off by only configuring the middle one, because as I say, it enables you to define encapsulate all of these steps in one step. But if you have any more questions on groups and then access permissions, authorizations, just let me know. There are some more advanced features. For now, I will not talk about them, but if they come up in the future, obviously we'll happily explain how to use things like wildcards, policies, and things. But for now, we will set that aside, and I will just remove this from your staging repository, because you probably don't want to start off using that right now. Thanks very much.